welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and start today's Echo session. Welcome to our Healthy Relationships Echo. If you've not taken a minute, if you'll just put your name and contact information into the chat, that just again helps us get to know everybody on the call and know where everybody's working. So when things are shared or talked about, we all know who to reach out to or to be able to just build those professional connections. We are recording today's session. They are stored on our Canvas page as well as our YouTube channel. So you are always free to go back and watch this again. I know if you're like me, it takes me a while to really gather that information. So I love hearing things multiple times. We do want to make sure that Echo is an interactive community. So please turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable doing it. Ask your questions. I will be monitoring the chat today. So if you have questions when our presenter is speaking, I'll make sure those get answered for you. We always will have a case narrative. It's a great way to learn from all these amazing people on the call about different questions and families or clients that we're working with. So please consider doing a case narrative. But when we are talking about it, just remember to avoid using any identifiable information. If you have any questions about that, you can reach out to one of our hub members. They all have or will now have an asterisk in front of their name. It's just easier to find them in chat. Key components of an Echo session is one, to build that professional development. So knowing other people that are working in the field with us. So that's why we ask you to turn on your cameras, put your contact information into chat, and why we have those small breakout groups. We will always have a didactic speaker, as well as then a case presentation where we all get to share our recommendations and feedback for the case. We've all been on Zoom for a while, so if you'll just take a minute to rename your profile, here's how to raise your hand in case you need to know how to do that, as well as how we send out a credit for attendance. Throughout today's session, we will be dropping the survey into today's chat. That's how we ask that you complete that, and the people that complete that survey get a credit of attendance. So we email out certificates that then you can hopefully utilize to get continuing ed. We do also have a Canvas page. So if you would like access to our Canvas page, just email projectecho@usu.edu with healthy relationships in that subject line, and we will get you access to the Canvas page. Today's presenter, Megan Schmidt, has shared some wonderful resources for her presentation that are on the Canvas page. So I'm sure everybody will want one of those. Again, we also have social media where we share information that is provided to us from everybody, as well as any of our Echo upcoming sessions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and turn the time over to Megan, who is going to be talking to us about mandatory reporting.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Janelle. Hello, everybody. My name is Megan Schmidt. I am the training manager with Adult Protective Services. I'm going to get my slides going. And yes, you can put your questions into the chat. I also, as you will kind of learn during our short time that we have together, I can talk and talk and talk. So if you do have a question regarding any of the information, please feel free to stop me at the time, and we can go through it, but I do also have time at the end for questions as well. So just quick backstory for me. I have been with Adult Protective Services for almost 6 years now. I worked in an investigator role and then also in this training role. So I train all of our new incoming staff that are going to be in various positions, but then also as well, I'm training our incumbent staff, so ongoing, and then anybody in the community who may need additional information about mandatory reporting, who is a vulnerable adult in the state, but then also just how to work more effectively with our agency. So if you do have questions, again, just please ask, but I look forward to kind of the time that we have together. So what we are going to kind of the learning objectives or what we're hoping to cover during this time is describing the role of adult protective services. That is really important as it relates to vulnerability, not just within adult protective services, but then also as it kind of differs within other agencies or services that may be providing in that role. We'll define abuse, neglect, and exploitation and possible warning signs, look at some effective reporting criteria, and then describe the steps to take if abuse, neglect, or exploitation is suspected. So with just a stat that I feel like is starting to resonate a little bit more and just something that I feel like is important for us to know just as a society and kind of anybody that's working within a helping profession, that for the first time in US history, older adults are projected to outnumber children by 2034. So I get asked frequently, like, why is that important? What does that mean? What does that look like? And the main reason for you to know is that it's never happened before. So we are in the 2030s, it's going to be really transformative for us as a decade, as a population. We will be shifting from a kind of a demographic where it's young families having lots of young children. We are going to be shifting into an aging population. And so it's just kind of important to know that service delivery is going to look a little bit different, but then it's also the needs, services, resources, or the benefits that older adults may need or could be eligible for are going to need to adapt. And the other reason why it's most important, especially as it relates to our work with adult protective services, is we are going to see a caregiver gap moving forward from the 2030s on. And what that means is we will have more older adults who are requiring a level of care that's unique to them than what we will have in terms of trained, educated, and willing caregivers, whether that be family members or those informal supports or those kind of paid caregivers that we would know. We are going to see a shift in terms of what's available and what's out there. And we are also within that are going to age considerably into an aging nation, but it's going to be a big change because it's never happened. And it's also something that's going to be uncharted in terms of how we are going to navigate that moving forward. And then looking at our division, so we are with the Utah Department of Health and Human Services, but our division is Aging and Adult Services. If you're familiar with us, you might hear us referred to as DOS. And our division has the administrative authority over Adult Protective Services, or APS, which is the agency specifically that I work with. Since we're on this page, and I've mentioned Adult Protective Services a few times, I will ask that if at all possible moving forward, if you're ever talking about our agency, excuse me, our services, to refer to us as Adult Protective Services instead of APS. And the reason why is APS and AP&P sound really similar out in the community. And if you are familiar with the term, AP&P is adult probation and parole. So we do have a number of individuals that will assume that we are there under a criminal capacity or that we are there for an outstanding warrant or a home check or even like a drug test or something like that. We as an agency do not offer or function under a criminal capacity. So we are a civil agency. And so letting them know and kind of helping them understand the differences can really reduce the barriers for us being able to get in the door. Just for you to know, kind of like a quick little anecdote on it. So when I was working as an investigator, I would show up, and even when I would use adult protective services, people would assume or hear adult probation and parole. And I would have a number of people that would say, "You don't look like a probation officer." And so it's just kind of that knowing that that's a barrier that we have to kind of face right off the bat is something that's important in any way that we can kind of break that down just to help increase the likelihood of us being able to work with the individual, but then also offer services in kind of a safe and supportive way. So within this, our division has adopted a vision statement of offering choices for independence. And the reason why that's important to know is that we as an agency, so with Adult Protective Services, our goal is to offer choices for independence. And what that oftentimes looks like is helping individuals age in place or in the environment that they want to. And that's important because it doesn't always match up with what family members, neighbors, medical providers, even law enforcement feels like is in the best interest of that person. And so we have had situations where that offering choices for independence and honoring that self-determination piece does not always match up with what other people feel like is in the best interest for that person. So there could be a situation where a referral would come into our agency and we are helping that individual secure either services, benefits, resources to remain in their home, even though family members, neighbors, other people feel like it would be best for them to move into a higher level of care. So there might not always be kind of the same match. There might be a disconnect that happens from time to time. And then our agency specifically, so Adult Protective Services, we're the state agency with the responsibility and authority to investigate allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation involving vulnerable adults. So let's kind of define who a vulnerable adult is in the state of Utah. So in Utah, we have two categories. We have an elder adult is defined as anybody that's age 65 or older. And so you can, in those situations, have a individual who is able to function pretty independently on their own, but due to age, they could be deemed a vulnerable adult. And then we also have our dependent adults. So those are individuals that are age 18 or older that have a mental or a physical impairment that substantially impacts their ability to care for themselves. The takeaway and what you need to know beyond our two categories is for our dependent adult, there's no diagnosis, disorder, condition that automatically makes somebody vulnerable. We really look at this on a case-by-case basis and unique to that individual. It's also unique to potentially the time period for the person. And so these are the 6 kind of factors or domains that we look at with determining vulnerability. So they only need to meet one of these 6 categories, and it is determined by our investigator when they're going out to do the interview. So backstory for you to understand, if you would contact our agency at Adult Protective Services, our intake staff are going to ask you if the person is under the age of 65, how or where are they substantially impaired or impacted? And so you may say, well, they have a diagnosis of dementia. They will go on further and say, but how are they limited or how are they impaired in that area due to that, either that behavior change or that limitation in their functioning. And so these are kind of the 6 categories that they're looking at. So being able to identify and understand where that limitation would be can help to determine if this person may be a vulnerable adult, and that would warrant a case being opened for investigation. I will say that of these 6, we will have times when only one is identified. There are other situations where they'll have all 6 of these factors identified, and then our investigators are going out and they're verifying this, and that's how they determine vulnerability for individuals. And so it's best not necessarily to think of the diagnosis or condition. It's better to think about where their functioning is limited and what that looks like. And then looking at what our agency can do. So this comes from our statutory obligation and our responsibility. And so this is within our powers and duties of Adult Protective Services. We will investigate the reports that come into our agency for abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Our investigators, who are working in the capacity as a social worker, they are conducting assessments and interviews for everybody that's involved within the allegation or the case that we're investigating. And so that would include that vulnerable adults who, once they become part of an investigation, are generally referred to as an alleged victim. In like case notes and different things, when we're communicating with them, it's always going to be referring to them as their name or however they prefer to be identified. But for you to know, that's how they're referred to in the investigation, as an alleged victim. Then we have the alleged perpetrator who is involved in the case as well, and then any collaterals. So this could be family members, law enforcement that's been out to do welfare checks. This could be medical professionals, anybody that's providing service or care. They could be deemed as a collateral in a case. And then the protective needs assessments, we are determining the level of risk and level of concern as it relates to that allegation. And our investigators are only determining capacity to consent as it relates to the allegation itself. So we're not conducting global capacities. It's more, do they have an understanding of the situational factors? Do they have an understanding of what their options and choices look like? Do they have an understanding of what the consequences are of remaining in that situation? And then finally, how would they implement those changes? And that's specifically just to the allegation of caretaker neglect or emotional abuse or financial exploitation. So they really are looking at just their understanding as it relates to that piece. And then lastly, the coordination and making referrals. I feel like that part is quite possibly one of the most important pieces that we do. And the reason why is that we are an investigative agency that's providing short-term services or kind of assistance and resources. So we are generally open for around 45 working days through the investigative process. And a lot of those service delivery waiting lists, different things like that, that person may not be eligible or come into service by that time frame. So we are looking to see whether it be through our local area agency on aging or the Division of Services for People with Disability, the Office of Substance Use and Mental Health, or a community-based organization that may be able to assist this person in connecting to long-term resources. We do have currently short-term care coordination that can happen. Those are for situations where there has been an investigation of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, and then our investigators are referring on to care coordination, which is generally up to around 60 to 90 days additional after that. And so it's still just kind of those short-term services, but it's to hopefully help connect and kind of piece together all of those resources. And then what our agency is not able to do. So this part is important to know, mainly because there is a misconception that's out there that we are child protective services for adults. And you can call our agency, you can make a report, and we will come and remove somebody from their home and place them in a nursing home, or we will come and take over as conservator or guardian for this individual due to the decisions that they're making, or because they're a fall risk, or just because you don't feel like they're safe to continue to live in their home or in the community anymore. So just for you to know, that's kind of where that separates, to know what our agency looks like. So unless we would have circumstances that would demonstrate that this person is at imminent risk of harm or death, we are not able to enter into somebody's home or remain in their home without their consent. I will say our investigators are very creative in terms of how they will attempt and complete interviews. We have had interviews done through cracked windows in somebody's home. We've had them where they just open the door just enough for us to see kind of part of their face. And if we're able to speak to that person, we will do interviews that way, kind of with the goal of hopefully developing enough rapport that that person will open the door more, be willing to talk to us. We have done, especially during kind of the pandemic time, we were doing FaceTime interviews with individuals. I personally, as an investigator, I have shouted up into like a second story balcony, trying to get the person to agree to come down and talk to me further. The list goes on and on. So we will do kind of whatever we can to do an interview and kind of gain access to that individual. But we do have to honor self-determination. And if we don't have consent to enter into a home or interview the person, then we're not able to take it further beyond that. We don't remove adults against their will and place them into other living environments. There is a small little asterisk that's there. We do have an emergency removal process, but we do have to be able to demonstrate and gather enough evidence to show that this person is at risk of harm or death without our emergency kind of process and removal. And if we do have enough information, it would be petitioning to go in front of a judge to request that a emergency order be placed to help us be able to essentially take access to that person and their decision making and then move them into a different living environment. An example that I can give to help kind of understand is if we have somebody that's living in the community that's a vulnerable adult who requires maybe 24/7 care or complete hands-on care where they're not able to be left alone for any period of time, and their caregiver is being arrested or taken away by ambulance due to a medical emergency, and now this person is left home alone without anybody to care for them. So those are kind of the examples that we're looking at, or situations where somebody has demonstrated that they are at risk of imminent harm to themselves due to diminished capacity or decision making, maybe where they're making choices or living in an environment where they are at high risk of a very serious injury happening to them. So those are kind of the situations and cases we're looking at. We don't take custody of adults. We do work with the Office of Public Guardian. We work with family members or private guardianship agencies across the state if we would need to look at guardianship. We don't place adults in nursing homes or other facilities. We do get called frequently to ask us to move a loved one into a nursing home. It's usually, we really feel like my grandma should live in a nursing home. We had a family meeting and she's refusing to leave her home. Can you go out and help her move and make that decision for her? And so those questions, it's usually from a reason of them wanting to help and be supportive to that person, but I don't think they really have an understanding of placing somebody against their will into a higher level of care and the level of restriction that that places on that person. Again, we don't provide any services without voluntary consent, and we don't do welfare checks or wellness checks. And the reason why that's important to know is that currently we have 24 investigators for the state. So if we were doing welfare checks, it's kind of all we would do all day long. We do have a very vast area of the state that are covered by a small number. For you to know, we have currently in our kind of Bear River area, so like Box Elder, Cache, and Rich County, we have one investigator that covers that region. So it's, if you do have a concern for an individual, for their welfare, their safety, please contact the local non-emergency number where that person resides. And then a patrol officer or a member of the sheriff's department, law enforcement, can go out and check in on the welfare of that person. We do have welfare checks that will turn into APS investigations. That's generally coming from law enforcement when they've been out and they've determined that there's a concern, but we do not have the capacity to just go and check on the welfare of somebody without there being an allegation tied to it. And this is just kind of looking at our principles and our services. The one piece that's important to know within our administrative rule is that a vulnerable adult with the capacity to consent has the right to self-determination. And capacity to consent is actually defined in our Utah state code. And so it means that the ability of an individual to understand and communicate regarding the nature and consequences of decisions relating to the individual themselves. And this is relating to their property, their lifestyle, and it also is including the decision to accept or refuse services. Since we are a voluntary service, we do have individuals that do have the right to say, no, I'm not interested in working with your agency, or I'm not willing to provide information or to take any steps further to discuss anything with you. And we do have to honor that if they've demonstrated the ability to have the capacity to consent. And then that kind of goes into that next step, and it ties back to our offering choices for independence within our vision statement of kind of what rights does a vulnerable adult have in regards to a report. And so again, a vulnerable adult with the capacity to consent has the right to self-determination, and that right to self-determination gives that vulnerable person the right to make decisions that may not appear to be in their best interest. So that is examples are, and how that kind of looks is when we have individuals that are living in environments where other people may not feel like it's safe for them, or it's not hygienic, or it's not aesthetically where this person should be living. It may be clutter in the home, or living in an environment that other people do not feel like is suitable. This also could be individuals that are remaining with, or at this time staying in a relationship where it may be deemed harmful to that person to continue to do that. So that is something that we do have to respect, because we are working with adults who do have the right to self-determination. Our goal within that is helping that person understand that they do have options and choices. Here are the alternatives, and then how we can help them safely know what the resources are when they are ready to make a change, when it's on their terms or when it makes sense for them. So these are allegation types that we investigate. We will not go through all of these. We'd be together for an entire day going through everything, but we will kind of just touch briefly on each of them for you to see definitions and then kind of those warning signs. So abuse and how our current statute is written, I will say with this caveat, we are currently within our legislative session. We do have some amendments that are being made to language. So a couple months from now, even a year from now, this language may look slightly different. So it's good just to know and kind of refer back to our Utah code to see what the most updated language is, and then to kind of see the timeframes. So currently, abuse means knowingly or intentional, attempting to cause harm, causing harm, or placing another in fear of harm. And the reason that knowing or intentional piece is there is that with caregiving, whether it be hands-on care or whether it be from like a care provider in a facility to somebody living in their home to a neighbor, different things like that. There is an inherent risk of injury anytime that care is being provided to somebody. So there could be a time when there is bruising that happens, a fall could happen, there could be skin tears, different things. So we need to be able to, and within our investigation, demonstrate was this knowingly or intentionally caused to that person. And the physical injury harm of the allegations that we look at, most individuals think about the kind of physical assault piece. So the hitting, kicking, punching, biting, slapping, pulling hair, different things like that. So what we would think of if we would think of somebody being physically assaulted. But then also within our Utah code, it's important to know that physical injury could be damage or conditions that are described below. So it could be situations of that physical pain that's happening if there's an impairment in functioning for that person, but it also could be a pressure sore, so like a bed sore, different things like that. So it does go beyond just kind of that physical injury of what we would necessarily think of, and it looks a little bit further into that harm definition. So just some warning signs of kind of that physical injury or harm piece to keep in mind. The one that I would say is probably the most important one to kind of keep an eye out for and recognize that it may be a red flag is an injury that's inconsistent with an explanation for its cause. And this is generally where if you have concerns that there's somebody that maybe sustained an injury from a caregiver or a family member, and the kind of reasoning that's being given or the explanation is varying between people that are involved, but then it also could be that it just does not really match up, where they're saying, well, yes, I was helping my grandmother to the bathroom, or I was helping my partner to the bathroom, and they slipped and fell and they landed on their left side, which there is bruising and maybe some injuries noted to the left side, but there's also bruising on the person's chest and on their back and on their neck in places where it just is not matching up when they're saying there's only one fall or one injury that's occurred to that individual. And the other piece is kind of, and it ties in with that inconsistency, is that dismissive attitude or statements about injuries. We have seen this, especially where individuals are maybe seeking medical treatment due to an injury that's occurred. And while they're trying to, based on either during the medical exam or from the medical professional trying to ask them what happened, they are having that caregiver, that family member, somebody present, and then there's basically talking over that person, or what we would think of like gaslighting behavior, where they will start to say, this is what happened, and they'll say, no, Sarah, this is not what happened. You fell, you're not clear. Or they'll make a joking statement saying, well, she's got dementia, so she can't tell you what really happened. I'll tell you what happened. So kind of that dismissive attitude about those things. Those are two of the big things to keep an eye out for that go beyond what we generally would think of with like the cuts, bruises, welts, those kind of physical signs. And then looking at emotional abuse. So this is knowing or intentional verbal or nonverbal conduct that's directed at a vulnerable adult. So it could result in the vulnerable person being in emotional distress. They could fear towards that person. There could be a level of humiliation, agitation, or confusion. And that does include behaviors such as intimidation, threats, isolating the person, coercing them into decisions or behaviors, and then also harassment. So I will say with this, one of the big things to remember, it does have to be directed at the vulnerable adult and how they result in this behavior. We will have calls that will come in and say, my client disclosed this to me, or I overheard the situation that was happening between two spouses. They were fighting. He was screaming at her, calling her names, and I was very upset. And I feel like that's so horrible that he would speak to her that way. So we are hearing how you, as the person witnessing it, how you are responding or how you're resulting from this, but we need to know how that results on that vulnerable person. And an example that I can give for this is we had a case recently where an individual, they were living in a higher level of care in assisted living, but they were completely independent, save for a few minor things that they needed help with, but they also wanted more of a social environment to age. And their son was coming into the facility in kind of the off hours when there was less staff in the building. And this individual would lock their door at night just to feel safe. And so it felt more like a private space. And their son would bang and knock on the doors and scream until they opened the door. And so even though they did not feel safe letting their son into the room, they did because of how the building was set up. They were right in the middle of all the other rooms, and they were very embarrassed by the situation, and they did not want to disrupt anything for anybody else. And he would come in and scream at the person and berate them and demand money. And so they would comply to these things, hoping that he would leave, and he would leave, but then the individual would stay in their room for long periods of time because they were very embarrassed by the situation and they didn't know how to handle it. They didn't really feel safe coming forward to staff at the time because they weren't sure. And the big piece was it was very limited in terms of how they felt like they could protect themselves because he would show up at very random time periods. So he would show up maybe 3 days in a row and then not show up for a month. So there was no way for them to kind of fully understand and how they could protect themselves. Just some warning signs of emotional abuse is, and this is kind of using that example I just gave, that unexplained or uncharacteristic changes in behavior. The staff, the reason why that they became aware of it and started noticing is because this individual started staying in their rooms for days after an incident would happen. So they would see them be out, they would join for meals, they would do activities, they would be walking the halls, different things. And then all of a sudden there would be a 2 to 3 day period where they wouldn't leave their room. And so that's how they started to kind of piece it together and notice that maybe there was something that was going on. And then as they kind of gathered some information, they brought it to start talking to the individual. And that's how they learned what was happening in the situation. So kind of those changes, or when it just shifts into a lack of interest in social contact, or if there is a risk for isolation for that person. So any of those big changes in behavior, or if you are just physically noticing or observing where that person is shutting down, or there's just a dramatic change after interacting with that person, that should be a little bit of a red flag or a warning sign to say there may be something more that's happening in this situation. And then caretaker neglect. So this is failure by a caretaker to provide the necessary level of care for an individual. So every person that's receiving care from a care provider has a unique need or level of care. So we do not have, say, like a checklist of things that need to be met. We are looking at it again as a case by case, and it could be their nutritional needs or having safe and clean clothing. It could be having the necessary shelter, whether it be having their utilities on or having a clear way to navigate through the home and not just a small path, or not using just space heaters to heat the home due to concern that a fire could be or happen. And it also could be making sure that that person is getting to all of their appointments and having their needs met. And so that's one of the considerations. The other piece that's important to know is that failure of a caretaker to provide care in a timely manner in comparison to what another provider in a reasonable position or the same position would do during that time frame. So we usually will see those a little bit more in higher levels of care, so nursing home, assisted living, skilled nursing facilities, or residential, where there may be multiple staff that are caring for that person, and then looking at what that reasonable expectation is of care. The other pieces that are important to know is if there's a pattern or conduct by the caretaker that's resulting in lack of care or lack of needs for this individual. It's not just a one-time thing that's happening. They're showing that it's a repeated pattern that's happening in terms of where they're not providing for the safety or well-being for that person. And then also the other one that we oftentimes may not think about a lot is that failure to carry out a prescribed treatment plan. And so as we look at relationships as we are aging, we will oftentimes see situations where maybe there was a caregiving role that was one side versus the other in terms of who was providing for what. And as this person ages, due to a shift in cognitive or health functioning, that caregiving role might flip or switch. And so in that sense, we have a lot of caregivers in the community, whether they be family members, so adult children, spouses, where they don't really have a full understanding of what that level of care takes. We have seen situations where family members will agree to have a loved one, say an aging parent, come and live with them. And then once they're living in their home, they have a realization of the level of care that it requires. And it's not something that they were ready for or that they were properly educated on. And so when we're looking at this, it's that knowing or intentional failure to carry out a prescribed treatment plan. So this could be not maintaining the dietary needs for this person, not maintaining their medication management. It could be getting them to physical therapy, dialysis, different things like that, where they're intentionally or knowingly failing to provide that. And the last piece is abandonment. We do see this from time to time. So it's that knowing or intentional act or failure to act that could include desertion of a vulnerable person based on their care needs. So just some warning signs and what to keep in mind for if you're concerned for that caretaker neglect piece. We are oftentimes seeing kind of that lack of basic hygiene needs or the care that they need. The one that I think is important to keep in mind is that lack of medical aids. So things that could make independence a more reality for that person. So this could be having an access to a walker or a cane or a wheelchair, or making sure that they have their hearing aids or their daily medications. We will have family members or caregivers that will say, well, Sarah keeps throwing her hearing aids away, or she keeps losing her dentures, or she keeps all of these things that will happen. But if that person has the financial resources to be able to replace those items, it is the responsibility of the caregiver to ensure that they have their medical aids or the things that especially could help them be more independent. A quick little example that I can give on this is we've had family members that will not replace hearing aids because then the individual, that aging person, cannot hear the phone ring. And so they're able to limit the contact that that person has at that point. And so that has happened before because they don't trust or they don't want them to communicate with other family members. And so if they can't hear the phone ring, they don't know that their other children are calling or trying to get in contact with them. Then financial exploitation. So this is our number one, and it's our fastest growing allegation, not just in Utah, but then nationwide. So this is the illegal or improper use of a vulnerable adult's property, funds, credits, assets, and it's for the benefit of somebody other than the vulnerable adult themselves. So it is the most common form of older adult abuse, but only a fraction of cases are actually reported. They say that we know about 1 in every 24 cases of abuse and neglect that are happening in Utah. And as it relates to financial exploitation, it's about 1 in every 50 cases that are happening. So there's a very small amount that are being reported. One of the contributing factors is that majority of our perpetrators are adult children or spouses or somebody that has a very close relationship. And so if they are financially exploiting the person, they are likely the only one that know that it's happening, and they're not going to report on themselves. So that's where it's kind of that community based, as we talk about kind of like advocacy and what that looks like, staying connected in the community, staying with close social contacts, getting out of the community. There's a lot of steps that individuals can take to kind of help protect themselves from this. And then just some warning signs of financial exploitation. One of the big ones that are important to know is family members or others that are just showing an unusual interest in kind of the assets, the property, or any of the possessions for that person, especially if it's somebody that has not shown interest in the past and now all of a sudden they are wanting to be involved. If, say, the partner or a spouse has passed away, and all of a sudden grandchildren are very interested in how their grandmother is aging and how things are going to be handled for them moving forward. That's also a red flag. And then the other one that's down on the bottom is if we have paid caregivers that are requesting kind of reimbursement or kind of an exchange of goods for assistance that they're providing. So this could be asking for money for rides, even if it's a service that's offered through maybe their insurance provider, or that's offered through aging services, or that's just part of the service provided that's given to that person. Or if it's being requested to say, well, we're going to go run some errands, you're going to go, you have saved your money, and so you're now going to go get lunch, but it'd be like, can you buy me lunch as well? Because I'm already bringing you for these rides, I'm taking you these places, and kind of that expectation of that there will be an exchange within that. And then looking just kind of quickly at our intake criteria. So we will accept reports that come into our agency except as followed. So when the referral does not involve an allegation that the vulnerable adult is or being abused, neglected, or exploited. And then also if the referral does not identify a current abuse, neglect, or exploitation, but it's mainly anticipating that something may happen in the future, or you have concerns in the future for a person. If it involves a vulnerable adult that resides on an Indian reservation, our agency currently does not have jurisdiction or an MOU to be able to investigate on tribal land. It is something that we are working towards to have that determination and be able to assist, but currently we do not have jurisdiction. When it's involving an incident in a long-term care facility where there could be alleged thought loss or theft of a person's money or personal possessions, and then we don't know, there's no identified perpetrators involved, but then those items are being replaced, returned, or reimbursed by the facility, that would be determined more as an incident report. And then lastly, when it involves an alleged financial scam or consumer fraud, and the reason why is because they are happening at such an exponential rate that we are not able to investigate those. Financial exploitation is the number one allegation, but we also see probably on average 50 to 60 reports coming a week of just scams and frauds that are happening for our aging population. So if you're able to identify a perpetrator, or if you have an idea of who it is, that's something that we would definitely look at. But if we are looking at concerns of money that's being transferred through like gift cards and then being sent, or if there is money coming in and out of accounts that this person is kind of communicating with other individuals, we will refer either that reporter or that person to where they can go to try to stop that scam or fraud from happening, and kind of education that can be to prevent it from happening in the future. And then what information do you need to share with Adult Protective Services? The big thing is please share as much information as you have. So as much as you can about that vulnerable person. It seems like we will get cases from time to time where it'll just give an address or a general location, but we really need to be able to know like an exact address, an email address, a phone number, just multiple ways that we can try to connect with and increase the likelihood of being able to interview that person. Where do you refer people when scams are happening? So that could go through the Federal Trade Commission. It could go through consumer protection within the state of Utah. We will also refer them on to the National Fraud Abuse hotline. So it's a network that you can call. AARP has a fraud watch. So there are resources that can be out there. It is also recommended to refer it on to law enforcement to see if it's something that's happening kind of as a pattern within the community. And they also have the ability to report on, or individuals have the ability to report to the FBI for concerns that may be happening with consumer frauds that are happening. So it's not, we will help connect that person and refer them on to where the agencies that may be able to look into it. So you can reach out to us, but just know that there are a wealth of other agencies that are able to look into what those would be for scams and frauds. The alleged perpetrator's name, living situation, contact information, being as specific as possible is the best thing. One of the other big things to know is if you know that alleged perpetrator is out of the house or gone or having different things going on from a certain time period, like say you know that they work Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 12 to 3, please let us know that, because our investigators will come out Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 12 to 3 to try to connect with that alleged victim to be able to talk to them further about what's going on. Collateral information as well, those family members, providers, supports, anybody that you may know that could be involved is really helpful. And if a collateral person did witness this and then they referred on or disclose the information to you, please encourage them to contact our agency as well, so that we can really have kind of that firsthand witness or that information that happened. And then any documentation that you can share, whether it be a care plan, photos, information that could aid in the investigation process, and then also your information as the referent. So our goal is to be as collaborative as possible during an open or an active case. Once a case is closed by your agency, it is considered a record, and you do have to go through the grandma records request process to be able to gain access to that information. And then looking at mandatory reporting. So Utah has a mandatory reporting law. Our Utah code is kind of written right there, the 26B-6-205. And that any person who has a reason to believe that a vulnerable adult has been the subject of abuse, neglect, or exploitation shall immediately notify Adult Protective Services intake or the nearest law enforcement agency. So it goes on to say that when an initial report is made to law enforcement, then their agency, whether it be local police department, sheriff's department, they will contact our agency as well, and we will work kind of as appropriate in a coordination effort to provide protection or different resources, different things like that to the vulnerable person. and failure to report. So what if you are aware of an adult protective services issue and you choose not to report it? We do have a penalty clause within our mandatory reporting, and it's the penalty clause is kind of down at the bottom, but an individual is guilty of a Class B misdemeanor if they willfully fail to report suspected abuse, neglect, or exploitation of a vulnerable adult to either our agency, Adult Protective Services, or the nearest law enforcement agency. So here is our reporting information. Our intake staff are there Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And you can reach them at 1-800-371-7897. Or you can make a report online at dos.utah.gov, which is our website for our division. It has a lot of information on there beyond just reporting information. But if you do go to our website, right on the homepage, there's a little green bar that says Report Abuse Online, and you click that and it'll walk you through the process. So whether you are calling our agency or if you're reporting online, you will be asked the same questions in the same series of information. And so it's good just to know kind of what that looks like. And so here are some screenshots of what our online reporting looks like just for you to know. Oh, here's our website first. So that Report Abuse Online. And then here's what it'll be asked. So this is kind of the fill-in area for our online reporting. It will ask you to provide as much information as you can for the victim. And then there's also, and so with that, it's their name, their date of birth, any identifying information that you have, especially if the person is residing in a residential placement or maybe a group living situation, or if they're currently unhoused. As much information as you can provide can help us be able to locate the person as quickly as possible. And then also the suspected abuser, who would be the alleged perpetrator. There's space for up to 3 perpetrators that can be listed within an investigation. If you have concerns that there's multiple perpetrators, it likely would be best to call us so that we can continue to add those perpetrators versus just in this form. And then the reporting party is your information that's in there. And so it would be all of that information that would be important to put in there. So your information, how we can reach you or how we can contact you. And then that's important because we will make a follow-up call and kind of let you know what's going on within the situation. And then the incident information that's on there is where it happened, when it happened, kind of that additional information, especially if it happened within a facility that we could identify to help with that process. And then also the looking at kind of what abuse happened. So we've got the abuse perpetrated by others. We've got our incident reporting in there. We do have a spot for self-neglect, and then also looking at the specific incident. And so within that is letting them know and be as specific as possible. So let us know what happened today that might make you feel like you need to make the report. So your observations, beliefs, statements made by a victim. So any information that you can put in there is really important for us to know. And then lastly, this is where the collateral information is in there. So any persons who may be involved or any other situation that you feel like could be helpful for us to reach out to. That's good for us to know, whether it be family members, collaterals, anybody else that can help with that process. And then lastly, here is my contact information along with our reporting information as well. It's a good thing to just kind of take a screenshot of, or just know that that information is there to be able to reach out. I will say that you can call our agency just to ask questions as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be to make a report right away. It could be to gather just a little bit more information. It could be to find out about resources, services, how to help guide somebody, additional agencies that could be involved, or you can call us to make a report for abuse, neglect, or exploitation. But that is all the information that I have, and I will open it up to any other questions.
Megan, thank you so much for all that information. I am just going to pause and see if anybody has questions. You can put them into chat or just come off mute and ask. Okay, it looks like everybody has all their questions answered. Oh, very informative. Thank you. I was like, there's a question. Never mind. All right. Well, I'm going to thank you again for sharing that with us. All of that information and some extra things that Megan shared today will be on our Canvas page. I'm going to turn the time over to Allie. She is going to go over our case presentation today.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you, Megan. So Megan just showed us the APS report online form and what that kind of looks like. So our case study for today is going to follow that APS form. Could you put it in the chat there, Janelle? The
Yeah.
link while I read it. So the name of the person in this report, his name's Joseph Williams, has his birth date, his personal cell phone number, another cell phone number that was attached to him, his home address, which is a group home, known disability, autism spectrum disorder. It notes here that he does not pose a risk to a provider in our experience. Known family, Uncle Craig, adoptive mom Kelly, biological mom Jan or Janessa. Limited guardianship is had by a Kelly Williams, and that does include medical decisions for Joseph Williams. Support coordinator Dottie Smith with Your Advocacy Services, and this person was assigned to Joseph by DSPD Services. Additional support is provided by Dr. White at Mountain Youth Services. The date of assault was September 28th, 2020, so this was a few years ago. The perpetrator name that was given by Joseph, his name was Bill Black, and there was a note here that another person was present during the assault. His name was Topher Monson, who lives at another group home, Lakeside Group Home. Further down on the APS report is where you kind of type in that narrative of what happened or why you're reporting this. So here is the narrative that aligns with Joseph in our mock APS report. During a community class offering education to adults with disabilities around abuse prevention, a student disclosed he had been assaulted out loud to the class. This student was Joseph Williams, and when he announced the assault, it was very matter of fact and without distress. The two class facilitators removed Joseph from the class and spoke with him in private. Joseph explained he had been assaulted, using the word rape, 4 years prior while he was homeless. He was walking a nature trail with another friend and was approached by a stranger. The stranger invited them back to his house and then assaulted Joseph while the friend watched. Joseph went into great detail about the assault and mentioned he knew the name of the attacker and still had his phone number in his phone. The facilitators asked Joseph further questions like what happened after the assault, who knew about the assault, did he see a doctor, and if this was the only time that it had happened. Joseph said he was still experiencing itching and burning in his private area and hadn't seen a doctor about it since he went to the emergency room about a week after the assault. His group home took him to the ER after he was defecating on his bed and having abdominal pain. It was then in the ER about a week after the assault happened. Joseph told the doctors what happened to him. He wasn't able to answer if he had been given preventative medication for possible STIs, nor was he able to answer if he had spoken to police. Knowing he was still experiencing symptoms related to his private areas, facilitators asked him if he knew what STDs were and had he been tested recently. Joseph wasn't able to define STI and was not able to say if he had been tested. The facilitators asked Joseph who they could speak with in his support system about this disclosure. Joseph did not want them to share this story with anyone and would not provide any contact information. After the interview with Joseph, the facilitators spoke with their supervisor for guidance on their duty to report this to Adult Protective Services. Their supervisor was unsure whether to report it or not since it seemed to have happened 4 years prior. Janelle, do you want me to go ahead and read these questions too? Okay,
Sorry,
so
that I was on mute, so you couldn't hear anything I was saying, could you?
no.
Oh, okay. So those are just for us to do in our breakout groups. So we are going to go ahead and do just kind of have a discussion about this case in general. And so Allie is going to be the facilitator of one breakout group, and then Alex will be the facilitator of others, and just kind of talking about, based on what we heard of the mandatory reporter, things that you guys heard in this case. What would you all do? How would you handle it? But again, just because we are building that professional networking and trying to get to know everybody on the call, take a minute and introduce yourselves, knowing that we're going to, hopefully everybody will share information. You all have great knowledge and expertise on that. So go ahead and open up those breakout rooms, and so each of you should see that you have a breakout room, and we'll just stay in those for a few minutes and then come back. Hopefully there was some great discussions that happened in that call. Alex, do you want to go over one or two ideas from your breakout group?
Yeah, sure. And then we also had a question that came up that I would like to pose to
Okay.
anyone here. Just trying to search for some resources for somebody. Okay, so we went back through the case study and we discussed whether to report or not, if that was the right choice to make. And we talked about if there was any harm in having a duplicate report. So if this Joseph Williams was in the ER, we would assume that the doctors there are also mandatory reporters and would have already made a report. So is there harm in reporting again? And we said no, probably not, because all they're going to do is hopefully link that old report to the new report, and it would be more of a follow-up. Um, we're also assuming that when he was in the ER, he may have been tested for some STIs, but not all STIs can be tested within a week of assault, that you do need 3, 6, 12-month kind of follow-ups. Um, and it seems like he was still maybe experiencing some discomfort. Whether it was related to the assault or not, he's a vulnerable adult who's experiencing discomfort. So sounds like he needs support. Also, we know that after people are assaulted, that they may have more questions about sex and sex education and relationships and what is healthy and appropriate and what's not. So this person could also benefit from more education. We also talked about how hard it would be to answer all of these questions for an APS report in kind of a really vulnerable conversation while this person had just disclosed this assault. So, how would you approach not re-traumatizing him? We talked about a trauma-informed approach, offering support, offering help to report this if they wanted to be the reporter, help making follow-up appointments with this person if that's what they needed, taking your time, and then also reminding them of how important and how brave they are for making this disclosure, and just really using that trauma-informed lens to support them through this, what could be re-traumatizing conversation. And then I wanted to pose a question that we were just talking about. We were talking about finding doctors or clinics that provide permanent birth control for people on Medicare or Medicaid within the state, if anyone has any resources for that or ideas of where to send someone for permanent birth control procedures who are from like a vulnerable population. And if you have a resource, maybe you could just drop it in the chat. Otherwise, that is what came out of our discussion.
Great. I don't know any off the top of my head. Alex, you came off mute, so were you going to share something that you knew?
I have seen a list of doctors floating around online who are willing to do permanent birth control. I will see if I can find that and email it to you, Allie.
It was actually for Crystal Kennedy. She just dropped in the chat. maybe Crystal, if you could put your email here in the chat, we could send those resources to you. And she's in Nevada, not
In
Utah.
Nevada. Okay, I
Yeah.
know it's a national database and I have
Great.
seen it online. And Crystal, if you want to throw your email in the chat, I will try to email that to you. And also, I will just CC you, Allie, in case that comes up.
Cool. Thanks, Alex.
Okay.
Alex, do you want to share what your group talked about in regard?
Yeah, let me just swap over to my notes. And so we kind of echoed a lot of what Allie already talked about. Just like whether we needed to report this and how that would affect this person. We also talked about disclosing the perpetrator or the witness and how that would maybe make the person who disclosed concerned, especially with the perpetrator, since they have their phone number in their contact information still, whether they'd be worried about retaliation or something, and how that would trigger an investigation with APS. But I think a lot of what our conversation focused on was providing emotional support to Joseph and letting him know that there are a lot of resources out there, and it is very brave to be able to disclose this. And then that even if he doesn't want to go through with the APS investigation, there are other people who can help him, including like victim advocates in the counties and the crisis and assault centers. Um, Annabelle, who just jumped off, has previous experience working in one of them and provided us a lot of good information on how that would function. And so I think those are some of the things that we talked about. And then at the end, right before our session ended, I said also referring Joseph to a therapist who specializes in PTSD and trauma and also has experience working with people with autism. Those are some of the things we talked about, is making sure that he has enough emotional support and other outside resources beyond just following the mandatory reporting process. It's just putting the person first.
Yeah, you guys had some great discussions around that. That's awesome. So if you will both email those the list of recommendations to Project Echo at aggies.usu.edu, and then Adam, I see your hand up. So
Yes, I want to follow up on Alex's statement.
okay.
So now that you mentioned about this conversation on autism, it is a really difficult situation if you're an autistic person like myself, especially when it comes to mandatory reporting. I am going to have a presentation in March about my lived experiences and my issues related to that. So I don't know if I'm on topic on this one, Alex, but we did discuss some in that breakout room on this on that discussion.
That's awesome. And
Thanks,
yeah.
Adam.
Oh, sorry, Alex, what you were gonna.
Oh, I was just saying thanks, Adam. I think that is really helpful for us to know, is how this would be different or impact people that have an autism diagnosis and how that needs to be taken into consideration as well.
Yes. And that is what our topic is for next month. So March 24th, we are having some presentations from individuals that have the lived experience, such as Adam, and I'm really excited about his presentation. And so again, thank you all for your time, and we will see you next month.